Hello and welcome to Mooks and Monsters. I'm Rob Ward.
And I'm Tim Niederreiter, and this is episode 91 of the podcast.
And today we're going to be going on a journey with your party. This is called How to Travel with Your Party. A lot of times in RPGs, we're going different places. We don't like to stay in one place unless it's like a superhero campaign where you have a base or you just are set in one city for a long time. But a lot of times you end up traveling, you end up going different places, doing different adventures in far off countries and planets, probably. And this episode, we're going to try to tell you what's the best way to approach traveling and how not to get bogged down in, because if you go to the airport, what's the important thing? You say you go on vacation, actually. The stuff that people want to hear about is, where you went to and what you did there. You don't want to talk about the taxi ride, or you don't want to talk about waiting in line for the TSA or waiting 8 hours in the Dublin airport like I did. So Tim, he particularly does a lot with space. And how do you navigate that?
Well, I try to come up with distinctive things for each place my players go. Or distinctive, so if you're going to this planet, say, as an example from the Reese's Hack game that we always bring up on this show, there was this point where a bunch of the characters later on went to this planet where this major house lived. It was the center of their power, and I described it, as being extreme. There was this extremely beautiful mountainside, and there was all these crazy gardens and stuff. And all the technology was very subtle because this was this is a far future thing. And and then there were also the psychic lions that roamed around in that area. So, there's a distinctive place with distinctive creatures and distinctive people. Those are really the three categories, but I think distinctiveness is really important. Making it memorable is a really important part. And so, like, if you're going to a place and you describe it as always being it's always, say, all the walls are always gray, all the floors are always made of asphalt or whatever, the streets or whatever. If you don't want every place to feel the same and look the same. And I think visuals are an important part of that. There's also obviously, as a writer, though, there's also obviously all the sensory detail, but mostly I think visual detail gets across very well to players because we live in such a visual society these days.
Absolutely. And I think going with that visual stuff is, feel free to not get bogged down, because I watch a couple of videos about the worst, quote unquote, the worst camp sessions I've ever played in, the worst games I've ever played. And in quite a few of them, it's people just stuck in traffic, or they're on a car, they're on a plane for 8 hours. And so it's totally understand, unless you're going to have an encounter, just go in to the transport, describe what's in it, what's in your transportation vehicle, and say, okay, is there anything you want to do? People say, I'll do this, I'll do that. And as you keep going, and after they do that, just say, all right, we're going to jump ahead for a couple hours.
Right, and until you arrive, yeah.
Exactly. And the only reason you should be staying on keeping on the transport is, or, walking in the forest and playing that out, is either you're giving your players an option to role play, which is always, a good option. And you can kind of sense when that's dying down. People get a little sidetracked. People get a little not interested, because that's where you can put in some plot points as well. Or you're gonna set up right for an encounter.
Right, because that's one of those trickier things about travel. Because if you want sometimes for things to happen to the PCs while they're traveling, like the classic wandering monsters and Dungeons and Dragons are similar. If you want that kind of thing to be available in the game, then you can't always just skip straight to your destination, because then it'll be very obvious that okay, you've been traveling for a while, and then something happens. It just feels like it's a way that would you be telegraphing that very quick, very fast. If you are always skipping travel completely, which is why I really like what you said earlier, Rob, about give them options of things to do while they're waiting, if they're on a plane or whatever. But then you can streamline the process of traveling, especially when we're dealing with relatively short travel times, like a few hours.
Yes. And a lot, that's something that I notice some newer GMs have that problem, where they just kind of get stuck in, well, it takes us 8 hours to cross the Atlantic, so we're going to have to, beef that up a little bit, so it's not just boring. It's totally fine to jump forward a day or a week if you want to, depending on what your session is. So going back, but let's go back to what you were saying about keeping things visual and keeping things distinct. Say that you want to portray that your party is going into a new environment. You look around and you describe how, my best description is probably South Dakota. Because you have the eastern part of South Dakota and the western part of South Dakota. Have you ever been there, Tim?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been through South Dakota. Never really hung out there much.
Okay. But you remember how you're going from east, when you first get into the state, it's very flat, it's very prairie.
Yeah.
And as soon as you hit around the Badlands, it gets a little rougher
and hilly.
Yeah, rocky and hillier. And then when you hit the Black Hills, it's just a very gorgeous landscape. But you notice like a hill here, a hill there, more hills, some more hills, and then total Black Hills. And it's
absolutely
beautiful. And that's my best way of describing, and you know more about geography than I do, Tim.
Do I?
Because you actually, well, fantasy geography.
Oh yeah,
you took that. You took that one class about from that one author.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I definitely have paid a lot of attention to how to create fantasy geography and stuff, being an author myself. But I don't necessarily see that as being all that important when it comes to describing individual places, which is kind of, I think, more like what we're talking about when we're talking about traveling, because you really can't. I mean, you can describe the landscape as somebody rides through it, but that's still kind of one area. You're saying like, okay, it's rocky, it's the Badlands. It transitions to the beautiful hills, the Black Hills, like whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that, but your destination, as much as the journey can be important, the destination is the part where where the players are stopping and resting, and then where they're going to have encounters. In an RPG, that's by far the most important location. So,
oh, absolutely.
So that should be so it should be emphasized over the other places. Therefore, details are important. And it depends on the scale of your game too. Like in the space opera game, that was an extremely large scale game, and so people can move very quickly, and so locations kind of had to be distinctive because you might not be there for more than one scene. In fact, you were usually moving quite quickly. So, and you could, and the transportation capabilities were so great in that setting that of course you could just appear almost anywhere, in very little time. So there are some locations that really do lend themselves to having more depth to them, such as early on in that game, or there was this orbital ring around one of the planets, and there was a habit, and it was one of those agrarian rings. So there was a lot of agriculture stuff. They were growing plants and stuff on it. And I remember that was important. That was like the first session of that game, or the first or second session. So it was pretty, and in that, at that point, the game was less fast moving a little bit. So that everything around in that session dealt with stuff around that ring and that planet. So that's the kind of thing that, like, okay, now we've got this location, and everything that we and when everything revolves around a location, that's a perfectly legit form of RPG as well. So if you go to a new place, you do all the stuff there is to do there, and then you move to another place. That's a strong structure. For example, Indiana Jones. That's basically the Indiana Jones structure. And so that they go to Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
then they go to and they end up on that island, and all that stuff. So I think that's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I skipped a few parts.
Oh yeah, but that totally makes sense. Indiana Jones definitely has the best travel montage in any movie series. Dun,
Definitely
dun,
one of the most classic.
dun, with the entire map. But no, that makes total sense that you should pay more attention to your destination.
Yeah, this isn't an open world game so much as it is a story driven game. That attitude of mine has changed since when I started running games, because it used to be I was thinking this is going to be more like a Skyrim or an Elder Scrolls game, or one of these MMORPGs where you can just walk all over the world. And I used to think RPGs were more like that, but now it's become, as I move on and I learn more about stories, I think it's more satisfying more often. Obviously you can run a game that's open world and about crawling across a map, basically slowly crossing a map. But if you have a story that can only be that you want to go to different places, and you can hit the high points much more quickly than that. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's a little bit rough. Obviously you can handle it better, in some ways better than others. Anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like you can also adjust to your timeline as a campaign goes, because if you're running like a 3-part campaign, then you don't have a lot of time to mess around. If you're playing a long haul campaign, you could definitely take the time to if you're going to Bulgaria from Italy, you can stop in Yugoslavia, Zagreb. I'm thinking Call of Cthulhu right now, or you could stop in you could stop in the Balkans somewhere before you get to Bulgaria.
Right. Yeah, and actually having intermediate places is probably a good way of giving people a sense of how far they're going. Because if the players feel like, oh, we just bounce back and forth between locations, like a lot of the later seasons of Game of Thrones in the TV show, well, then that can make the travel feel cheap. And in a fantasy setting, you don't want travel to feel like it was too easy, because frankly, unless you have super advanced travel technology, relatively to most fantasy settings, if you can fly, then or teleport, travel is going to be easier. But if you can't, then riding your horse through a war-torn land is actually kind of exciting, and you don't want to just gloss over it, I think. And if you do, it's going to make it feel weird. Like that's definitely been my reaction to the last few seasons of Game of Thrones.
Well, you're totally right. With travel, and especially fantasy, I noticed that a lot of people tend to get caught up in rolling the random encounter.
Mm-hmm.
So people will try to roll and see what they go through, which is a nice way to randomize what they're planning. What people would run into in the forest, or what they would run into going from one city to the next. But there's some people that just rely way too much on it, in my opinion. And there's some people that don't use it at all. Like, they're so set that we have to have a giant encounter right now. So making the difference between that two. If you have a environment and you feel like it doesn't really need a null encounter, you can get rid of it. But I do personally, I like to plan out my travels in RPGs with certain encounters in certain places. like I'm a very visual person. I draw maps.
Hmm.
So I like to put, all right, in this area here, there's going to be this thing. In this area here, there's going to be that thing. And usually five different markers. And then maybe like an alternate thing on the side as well,
Okay.
if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah. Like it
You
can or can have. Hmm?
you can replace one of the other encounters with it, or it might happen, it might not happen.
Yeah. Yeah. If anything, if they go all out of the way to explore something, they might run into this thing.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to do it too. Because if you have if you have a game where it's all about, okay, we're hunting vampires or something, and then but you've pissed off one, but if you don't piss off the Lord Vampire, he's not going to show up here. But if you do something, if you do drive him, kill one of his lieutenants and make him, then he's going to be chasing you or something, and that's a cool way to roll too. Whereas it's kind of like, it reminds me of the classic adventure Castle Ravenloft. I've never actually played it, but as it was described by Seth Skorkowski on his YouTube channel.
Oh yeah, Ravenloft with the Devil Strahd.
Yeah, exactly. The vampire who was was one of the first module NPCs to be created to be like a player character, in that he would move around and he would be aggressive and played like an actual adversary, rather than a monster who was just sitting around waiting for PCs to encounter it, kind of thing. And I think that's really powerful. So if you're going to use a map, I love the idea of having things that move around on the map, things that change based on what you do somewhere else, stuff like that. In Blades in the Dark, this is a game that doesn't have a lot of travel, at least not between cities or anything, but because it usually takes place in one city. But but because of all the different factions and their locations, there's lots of opportunities to make the city very dynamic, and so every location can change, or locations can change as things change, as the people who control them change, or or whatever, as they set up new say an alchemist sets up shop across the street from one of the gangs. That's going to change things, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like, instead of, I mean, while I like to have those encounters laid out in the travel, I also like to give a little bit of a geographical alignment to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, say that they decide to pull a lever in this part of the galaxy, instead of that part of the galaxy, it's going to be a different band of pirates that come after them.
Right.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you with having those options and having those, what's the word you use? Different, like, environmental factors.
Distinct factors.
Yes. Distinct factors. Because, yeah, I feel like,
or for example,
making
go on.
Mm-hmm, go ahead.
There's another really good way of doing this in like a D&D scenario, or any game or any fantasy kind of world, where you're roaming, and say you don't encounter orcs south of the hills, and then you suddenly do, and you realize maybe the orcs are being driven out of the hills, and there can be clues you can place like that. Like if you're playing a long running game and the orcs don't come this far south, and then but you've encountered orcs this far south, and there's something wrong. It's like you can place clues through the geography in the game, and there's so many good ways to make the PCs more sit up and take notice of what's happening in different places, and that's just one of them. It's pretty obvious.
Oh yeah, that's a great way.
Oh, thank you. I just thought of that. I was very happy with it.
Yeah. No, it totally is, because putting something out of the ordinary will hopefully catch your player's attention. Say for instance that like the orc example, or I think there's an entire Call of Cthulhu module that's based on a train.
I think so.
The Oriental Express, and just weird stuff just keeps on happening as they're in transit.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure if I remember the name of that one, but it sounds familiar.
It's I've heard of it in reference. I haven't played it. I haven't done anything with it. but doing stuff like that, keeping it interesting, keeping it fresh, will
Right.
make it a more enjoyable experience. Because, like, long story short, you just can't have people walking through the forest for ages, not encountering anything or doing anything, unless you're role playing, unless you have an encounter set up, unless there's a random encounter, unless there is a option for them to go to shop.
Yeah. Something
Yeah,
significant has to happen, or you shouldn't really
yeah.
have that scene in your RPG. Or at least there should be the potential of something significant happening. That's really what where it comes down to it.
Oh, exactly. Unless you want to play it for comedic effect.
Oh yeah, too.
Because if we were playing something like the wrestling RPG and we were on a plane, we could just spend an entire session goofing off on the plane and getting drunk and causing havoc.
Yeah, I'm
Like a
imagining
bunch of
now.
wrestlers actually did
Yeah,
in history.
I'm imagining now that a repeat of that chase with Goliath Kong and them chasing the Canadian Python, but that's on a plane now. It's like, oh no. That would not be as pleasant of an ending. It wasn't that pleasant of an ending in the first place. But crashed plane is a higher stake.
Something like that actually did happen in real life, with a bunch of wrestlers on a plane.
Yikes.
Yeah, it was oofta.
Well, I've said just about what I think. There's one other thing actually. I just was looking at my notes here. I think it's important to identify characters with different places, especially when you're talking about more micro positions. Like if you're traveling across the land, maybe you encounter a shrine in a fantasy setting, and the shrine is attended by priests or whatever, and there you go. Now you've got a character or two who can be the face for a different location, and then they're the person you interact with there. I think that's really helpful. It's kind of the Dresden Files RPG really does tackle that very well, in that every major location or every faction should have a face to it, somebody who's actually and add a personality to that group or that location. I think that's just a great idea for any game. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Totally, yeah. I pretty much said everything I wanted to do. Sorry, this was a little bit more of a rambling episode, but
I think we're okay. I think
yeah.
There's some good stuff here, but it's true, we weren't overly focused.
Yeah. Well, this has been a Mooks and Monsters. You can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can email us at podcast@mentalcellarpublications.com. You can listen to us wherever podcasts can be found, Stitcher, etc. Like us on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at StageChat. Tim's at TNeedleRider. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for listening.